All right, hello everyone. Today I'm recording this video in response to some stuff that I was watching on YouTube yesterday and have been going around in my mind kind of thinking about it. And I um I have to admit, first of all, I have a number of different YouTube channels. Um I have I basically on YouTube do things like do I have an astrology channel, and I'm interested in synthesizers and stuff like that. And at some point in time, I encountered a block, you would say, around, or at least I had some health problems, and I think to some extent maybe like there's some sort of stress around producing stuff like YouTube content that I decided to like take a break from for a while I was having health issues or recovering from health issues. And then, but one of the parts of this was the whether or not I was going to take something like doing astrology readings, which I have to admit, first of all, if I'm making this just in general, not from my astrology page, I admit that it's a kind of there's certain things that are a controversial topic due to a certain kind of skepticism about it, right? Where if you see, first of all, some people may validate like there's some kind of value to doing something like tarot readings or astrology readings or things like that. Some people may only see it as just a kind of a grift, right? And that there's no inherent value to it. Um, and that, or that if there is value, it's not as concretely tangible as like obvious material labor or something like that, right? And um, there is, or you could compare it to something like counseling. There's like, you could provide somebody a service that's like counseling or like talk therapy, but that if you do that, you have to go through the proper channels of education and training. And that if you're just giving people astrology readings and tarot readings, outside of that, it's like there's people who don't respect that kind of idea, right? So, but on top of that, regardless of whether people respect that idea, there's still this issue about are you going to do this as a business in which you're making money, and then the in that context is the push to make this a profitable business or something that you're just doing for the hell of it or whatever, right? And the thing is, I think by first of all starting with the problem of astrology, you can kind of see a certain illustration of the part of the issue here. And basically, in all this context, I'm thinking about this because I was watching a Nate Hagens video where he was talking about certain kinds of like blind spots. And he was like creating a listicle of all these things which are either judged as good or bad, I suppose, in a very like dualistic, binary kind of way. And then you're taking the idea of certain criticisms or certain values or principles that say profit is bad, extraction is bad, fossil fuels are bad, global markets are bad, all this kind of thing. And the point, basically, I like to criticize the approach of basically rather than talking about problems, rather than focusing in on the tangible problem, to abstract a kind of conceptual category that you call just profit on its own, that you can evaluate whether that is good or bad. You're just talking about the act of profiting without talking about the circumstances in which it's profiting from, right? And to give another example, so you could just say, is profit good or bad? Well, profit is good because then whatever you're doing is more sustainable economically. But then if you're profiting off something that some people would say, like if you don't believe in tarot, if you don't believe in astrology, if you don't believe in if you, all this stuff is just a grift, it's nonsense, it's basically garbage or valueless, and you are somehow able to profit off that anyways, then it's not the question isn't whether profit is itself good or bad. It's what's the ethical way to profit, off your business, right? Or what are some businesses inherently more ethical in the way they make profits than others, right? And then there's another kind of thing where the other kind of thing I do is I like to make electronic music, and I have a certain one of the motivations I have for reading more critical theory or philosophy is that, to be honest, if I ignore that stuff and I just indulge myself in, like, let's say, collecting synthesizers or guitar pedals or you name it, there's a certain kind of materialistic consumerism where on one hand it's really easy to press buy on a shopping cart and have something delivered to you, but there's something about that whole consumer economy and the materialism and the consumption of it all that makes me. But in all of this, there's this kind of thing about if you think about it in terms of profit, you could think about it in terms of, can you start to be successful as an artist or a creator to the point where the stuff that you are investing into your production costs as a kind of overhead cost, are you able to pay that off with the profits you make off of your project? And the thing is, when it comes to like art and music, in a lot of cases, artists and musicians are not able to do this, right? And that in order to have music festivals which cover their costs, they rely heavily on corporate sponsorships. And the more independent they are, the more there's a tendency to simply not profit, to simply go into debt, and then become dependent on becoming one of these kind of corporate festivals or whatever, right? And then so also similarly, there's this kind of tendency, I think, for musicians, especially people like synthesizers, where the point of it is not the amount of money that you're investing into your project versus what you expect to get out of it is kind of like not the point at all, right? But in this whole context, there is a certain kind of problem that arises here, similar to astrology, where do you see, if you're giving astrology readings or tarot readings for somebody, and whether or not you profit off that, whether that, or how much, then if you do profit, then that is basically determined by how much your service is valued in the marketplace. And that if you can convince somebody that your service is of high value and they pay you a lot of money for it, this could be considered a grift because there's no common consensus about whether or not what you're doing is of value or not, right? But then in the midst of that, there are all kinds of official professionals who have really reinforced the sense that what they're doing is scientific. It's grounded in objective reality, and everybody can agree upon the value of what you're doing. But when it comes to something like synthesizers, there's obviously a scientific, technological, tangible, that it's not just like somebody making up a fantasy and then selling that to somebody and calling it, some sort of a service. There's a tangible thing, technology, there's a tangible, but the thing that's being produced is a aesthetic thing that's, again, it's only the value of any artwork is subjective to the valuation of who is buying it and how much they want to pay for it, and that largely is prone to shifts and changes and fluctuations in what's trendy and what people's attitudes are. And to give you a great example of this, when it comes to not just making money off music, but when it comes to the music gear economy and the industry, is that there's certain people who, when synthesizers were very unpopular. I remember, I'm a millennial, and I grew up in this era of my dad was into playing in rock and roll bands and having an amateur recording studio and all this kind of stuff like that, or jazz bands too, right? And in all of this, there was I remember growing up with an attitude that some bands would, in their liner notes, as a joke, play say synthesizer, nobody, no synthesizer on this record. It was a sort of a status symbol. Synthesizers were seen as some sort of cheesy, plastic, artificial, inauthentic kind of superficial thing that just was hokey, and that bands would add this with a big budget production, but it wouldn't really add any. It was just a gimmick that didn't add any value to the music. And there's actually a story where people who ran music stores were basically, because they specialized in expert knowledge on guitars, there's a lot of different, like, a synthesizer is a whole different kind of area of knowledge and expertise, and people basically did not value the process of valuation. They did not value synthesizers the same way as guitars. And so in that secondhand music gear market, synthesizers were very devalued in terms of how much they would sell for. And then there was a sharp jump in popularity as people saw the opportunity to sort of do this buy low, sell high thing, I guess you could say. But at least if you're maybe not even thinking about that. If you're a musician, you're just looking for whatever you can get for cheap. And then there's certain things that just people got lucky, where things that you would buy for $300 would then 10 years later be selling for $3,000. And then 10 years later would be selling for $6,000. You see what I'm saying? And it's like the actual product, the technology is the same, but the market valuation of that same thing changes drastically over time. And what I'm trying to say is that when you're looking at profiting, you could see it as in terms of, we have a business, which is to create a product, which is music and records, and that the whole investment in there is like, can we invest money and then make enough money to pay off our investments? Or you could also just buy a bunch of stuff really cheaply and then wait until there's a wave of popularity and sell it off, and you don't make any money on your music at all. You're simply just hoarding a certain resource. And then, so this is what I'm trying to say, is that with profits, with the whole point of profiting, there's not really profiting on its own. You could say that you could attach it to this idea that if you profit off your business, it means that the product that you create is going to be making you money to pay off, to justify your investment. But you could also have your production completely fails, and it's just that you're owning the means of production then becomes the thing that is worth a lot of money on the marketplace. And then but the thing is, it's only worth something if it's valued. Like, there's a question of, like, why would you value something which presume is worth a lot of money, but you just kind of like make stuff that nobody's interested. Like, there's a kind of like question about what makes anything valuable in the marketplace in the first place, and your ability to profit may have a lot more to do with the marketing grift of getting convinced. Like, this is what marketing basically is. It's like, you take something like, for example, Red Bull. It was a very cheap drink in a different marketplace, and a foreign market. And what the capitalists do is take a commodity that in a certain context is not valued very strongly, and then put a lot of marketing hype into creating a big bubble around valuing this. So then you can take that thing, mark it up, and sell it to another. There's an externality, right? There's one place where something's not valued very much, and another place where it is valued very much, and your job is to find where those differences are, take things that are not valued, and then market them to the people who would value them, and just cash in on the difference there, right? There's something about the criticizing capitalism or criticizing profit simply as being just sustaining your business is kind of ignoring the wider context of what profiting and where is happening, and what kinds of valuations are being made. And there's a certain kind of like there's a certain ethos of what is the right way to make profit and what is the wrong way to make profit. And the problem about why profiting itself isn't bad, but then the problem is that to neutralize the whole idea of profiting as some abstract idea that's completely separate from the circumstances in which the profits are actually being made is to create this theoretical system that basically gives you an alibi for all these things that you can do. You can say that, oh, well, like, this guy said that profiting is fine. This guy said that surpluses are fine. This guy said that resource extraction is fine. This guy said that this is fine. And it's all just these neutralized conceptual categories that are divorced from the actual situations in which they occur, and when you can just treat them as just completely neutral, moral, like, and the thing is, saying that they're not bad does not necessarily say they're good, but that you're off the hook basically, and it just so long as make sure nobody actually looks at what you're actually doing to make the money. So with a magnifying glass, and you can actually see the details of where these problems. It's a whole game to sort of like cover up what the actual problem area is by making everything pointlessly abstract and conceptual, basically, right? And that the whole game of being a public intellectual is that there are all, like, this is, again, I made another video a while back about anti-intellectualism on I guess that was just my astrology channel, but one of the problems with anti-intellectualism, or why there's a critique of anti-intellectualism, has to do with the whole Hannah Arendt thing about the banality of evil, how the Nazis, the idea of like intellectualizing things to the point where you're creating euphemisms, where there could be things that are happening that are really bad, but you create these like these conceptual categories and use language like the final solution or the idea of evacuation, rather than saying that we're going to take all these people and kill them. We're going to say we're going to evacuate them from an area, which sounds like you're saving them, you're rescuing them, but it's actually so there's this kind of like, there's this Orwellian doublespeak thing where you can like say, oh yeah, well, I'm really profiting off my business, but then it's not that you are actually doing something of value. You're just hoarding resources and waiting for them to become more evaluated and then cashing in on the differential, basically, right? But then if you can say that, profit itself, like whatever, surplus is, like, there's all these things about like what the actual building blocks of the machine. It's like you break the machine apart into these individual building blocks, create a listicle, and say that these are all your blind spots about you're judging all these things negatively. But if we break it all apart and look at it completely divorced from context, you don't have to do that. Good news, everybody! Wow, like, so it's like the whole point is that nothing really makes sense unless you put it in relational context, but because everything's become so individualized and fragmented and isolated and divided, then we can just like completely avoid the actual relational context in which the problems arise, and then live in this sort of like neutral cloud world where you just don't have to like worry about things. And then it's like, I think it's better. The thing is, but the thing is, even me doing this is criticizing the problem at an abstract conceptual level, rather than pointing my finger at specific. But I mean, other than that, like my own, like if you're saying am I contributing to the economy by just collecting music gear, waiting for the value to go up, selling it off, and then calling that profit, right? Or you could apply the same thing to the dynamic of having capital gains or something like that, right? There's this idea that if you have investments in which you have a surplus, and because you're not using that surplus all at once, that creates the opportunity for doing lending and crediting and all this kind of stuff. And that if you're able to have a surplus and you're able to profit off that, and are you like, without actually doing any real labor or making any social contribution to society, then is that is profit in itself inherently good? Or is there anything, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, and then and on top of this, then there's like there's like and then you could also do something, have a project with the aim of doing some sort of social good or something, some kind of virtuous thing to help society, but then not being able to finance it properly in terms of the profit, your profit incentive or whatever, right? And so it's like, I don't know. I suppose in the midst of all this, part of the problem too is that judging that it's like basically talking about the dualistic binary moral judgment of things like profit, of extraction, of surplus, all this kind of stuff. And so there's different things going on. There's taking certain things which are as isolating them as these conceptual categories which somehow exist removed from the actual circumstances that they're actually in, so that they appear to be more neutral than they are, right? Um, and then there's the assigning of hard binary good bad moral judgments to them outside of that any context. The point here is that it's similar to the problem of archetypes, in that the whole idea about the archetypes is that you have all archetypal roles, for example, right? Like where you have the hero, you have like the teacher, you have the wise old man, the hermit, whatever it is. Or there's something about like when morality intersects with the archetypes, there are certain patterns of human behavior, or certain patterns of that form in nature even, right? And it's not that occupying any position in any of these systems is going to be inherently good or bad as like a moral judgment, but rather that each position has in its own pattern of either going wrong or generating some kind of a good, right? But it's like the fact is that like if you have the problems, there's inherent problems and there's inherent possible virtues that go with any of the positions, but you can't evaluate the goodness or badness of the category itself. You have to, it's only like the whole point of like the Greek tragedy, right, is that you have the human who is finite, and then you have the archetype as a kind of infinite pattern, or a pattern that is transcendent, in that it's like you are by being a father, a parent, or being a teacher or something like that, you're participating in a long tradition of people who have done the same stuff before you, and you may run into there's a landscape of problems that you may encounter when playing out these roles as a human individual, and that because you are finite and you are limited and you're an imperfect human being, you're bound to mess something up. You're bound to have some you encounter some moral obstacle or some kind of conflict, and you're bound to have some kind of a problem. And the whole thing about like Carl Jung and the idea that the gods have become diseases is that prior to the desacralization and the secularization of everything, this was part of a kind of mystical framework, right? Where it's like your own trials and tribulations as a human, and your moral failures were you struggling with these. It wasn't just a personal thing. You were struggling with these grand archetypes that were represented by the gods, right? And it was a hubris to think that you could solve the problem as a human being. And so the Greek tragedy is always like you faced with these eternal problems that everybody has been faced with. You are bound to fail. You're bound to get it wrong. You're bound to have some sort of personal shortcoming. And so that it's like some kind of like if we abstract, when we take these things like what does it mean to run an ethical business, right? And we take the problem of economics, of surviving in a competitive economic environment and all these kinds of things, and then in that kind of thing you abstract out ideas like profit, surplus, extraction as these kinds of like abstract principles that are completely devoid from the actual situational contexts. They start to be like, well, of course we need we need food, we need materials, we need all sorts of things in order by which to construct our civilization out of, and that, it's kind of redundant to suggest that like, to any one of these things is inherently bad on its own, right? But then to me, this just becomes like, oh, well, our gas industry is actually just like a plant that puts its roots in the ground to extract things. And so because we don't, you're creating, it's like morally neutralizing and then you get to be like, oh, I know, now that I performed all this, I must be doing the right thing because I've taken things which are uncomfortable and just made it all seem, I've taken the edge off all these things that bother me, and now they just seem like these neutral things that are completely divorced from the problems. And then and then there's this guy. Now I have to go out and do all this. I'll exercise and I'll do all these things to make myself feel good and put me in a good mood, a good self-regulate so that I'm in a good state of mind, and then so I can produce all these intellectual abstractions which help to push whatever the problem is away from me, so I can feel like I'm in control, right? And so I'm involved in this nonstop mental game to manage this thing which is inherently not very well managed, right? And it's like I think that this whole style of argument becomes counterproductive, and this is my attempt at criticizing it, anyways, right? The problem is that if to be more productive, it's better to isolate specific problems and get into the nitty gritty technical details of who is doing problematic shit and where they're doing but there's there's a incentive to doing it this other way, because I honestly think that part of the problem with politics is basically that if you do your politics in a way in which you actually pose a challenge to the problem, and you're going to make yourself into a target, basically, right? So there's some sort of advantageous thing to, instead of and I think that there's a lot of, I don't know, I try to listen to various material on YouTube. It's not just Nate Hagens, but it's a lot of people that are in this thing. And I think that it's if you listen to, if you separate the substance from what people are saying from the style in which they're saying it, I think a lot of the problem with anti-intellectualism comes from the fact that it's like an effort to make difficult conversations more palatable to people, right? That there's there's a lot of stuff that we'd rather not talk about, or that we, for whatever reason, tend to ignore or tend to push to the sides or not want to talk about the problems. And so that in trying to have an idea, present the argument in a way that's more palatable, there's something where you end up creating all these kinds of buzzwords, right, that sound like marketing slogans or something like that. And then you, instead of it's instead of really contemplating the difficulty of what we're dealing with, it starts to all sound very smooth and easy, like you're just sort of you're gliding over the surface of things, where you've got all these slogans I don't know, meaning making, or relevance realization, right? You could be this whole thing. What I'm basically trying to say, there's this I was watching this John Vervaeke guy as well too, and this is basically kind of what I'm I'm saying. I'm why I have difficulty with John Vervaeke is that what the point that I'm trying to make is that you have these abstract terms and categories that on their own, of course, they're not necessarily bad as some absolute binary moral judgment. Of course that they are categories that could either go good or bad, or right or wrong, or sideways, or whatever, right? But there's the idea of that that the whole, even discussing this problem rather than the actual nitty gritty details of what is the problem, you're so we need to do this process called a relevance realization. And you're presenting it in a way where you're we're in the midst of a huge collective problem, and I am basically a salesman who is here with a consumer product to sell you called relevance realization. And the more that I just pronounce this as wow, you guys, good news, I've figured it out. We just have to do relevance realization, and like we're just gonna sort everything out, and don't worry about it. You can just lay back and like have a spa date and like get massaged, and we'll just do all the relevance realizing for you, and we'll sort it all out, and everything will just be hunky dory, right? And it's like it's still just like this way to just avoid whatever the whatever the relevance realization is. It's like, oh, we're just gonna not talk about what the fucking relevant shit is, and we're gonna create a whole system of like intellectual euphemisms to avoid the problem, so I can continue my career as an intellectual and not get fucking card bombed by whoever is going to be the target of the relevance realization. You see what I'm saying? So I don't know. This is I don't know. This is just some stuff on my mind from hopefully. Well, what was I don't know. I'm not sure what to say to conclude this. Please like and subscribe and support this channel. Thanks for watching.